The Brooklyn Bridge at 2 in the morning in February does not belong to the living. It belongs to the wind, to the fog that rolls off the East River in thick, suffocating sheets that swallow the lamplight whole and give back nothing useful in exchange. To the kind of cold that does not announce itself politely, it simply arrives, gets inside your bones, and sets up residence there like it has always owned the place, and you are the one trespassing on its territory. The bridge lights fight against the darkness every single night. They never win. They cast everything in a pale, sickly yellow glow that makes the world look like an old photograph of itself faded at the edges, slightly wrong in the way that things look wrong when you remember them from too far away, when the details have softened into approximation and only the feeling remains. Most people who cross the Brooklyn Bridge at that hour do so quickly. Heads down, collars up, moving with the concentrated purpose of someone who has made a calculation about warmth and distance and come down firmly on the side of getting there faster, wanting nothing more than to be somewhere else, anywhere else, as fast as their legs or their engines will carry them. Reed Calloway was not most people. Not because he was brave, not because he had somewhere important to be, not because the cold didn't reach him the way it reached everyone else. It reached him completely. It found every gap in every layer of inadequate clothing, and it got in and it stayed. He moved across the pedestrian walkway with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had learned through 7 months of hard and unforgiving education that speed costs energy, and energy was a currency he could not afford to waste on anything that wasn't survival. Every step was a calculation. Every decision about which direction to walk, which shelter to try, for which block to cross, all of it, ran through the same equation, the one where the inputs were what he had, and the output was whether he made it through the night. He was 16 years old. He weighed maybe 140 pounds with the backpack on. The backpack held everything he owned in the world. A change of socks, still damp from 2 days ago, that he kept meaning to dry somewhere and never quite managed to. A broken compass that hadn't pointed true north in 4 months, but that he kept anyway because getting rid of it felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. And a sketchbook so worn at the spine that he kept it together with a thick rubber band he'd found on the sidewalk outside a post office on Atlantic Avenue 3 weeks ago. The rubber band was gray and slightly cracked from the cold, but it held. The sketchbook was the only thing in the bag he would not have traded for food, and there had been moments in the last 7 months when that calculation had been genuinely close, when the hunger was loud enough to make him look at the sketchbook differently, to do the math on what it might get him at a pawn shop, to hold the calculation open for 2 or 3 seconds before closing it. He always closed it. His jacket situation was not a jacket so much as a system of layered inadequacy assembled over 7 months through a combination of donation bins, church giveaways, and the particular resourcefulness that develops in people who have no alternative to resourcefulness. A gray thermal undershirt against the skin worn thin at the elbows. A flannel he'd found in a bin outside a Salvation Army in Crown Heights blue and green plaid, missing the second button from the top. A gray hoodie with a bleach stain on the left shoulder that someone had tried and failed to wash out, which told a small domestic story he'd thought about more than once. Over all of that, a cracked vinyl windbreaker he'd pulled from a donation bin outside a church on Fulton Street 3 weeks ago, dark navy with a zipper that worked 3/4 of the way up, and then stopped, which did approximately nothing against the February air, except give the wind something to rattle. His sneakers had a hole above the left toe that had been letting the cold in since November, and by this point in the night, his left foot had stopped registering temperature entirely, which he had decided to interpret as progress rather than the early stages of something that required medical attention he could not access. The city of New York did not know Reed Calloway existed. That was not a complaint. That was not even most of the time a sadness. It was the architecture of his survival, and he had built it carefully one invisible day at a time, understanding that visibility was the thing that had cost him everything once, and that he could not afford to pay that price again. The city's indifference was not a wound. It was a resource. He had learned to live inside it the way water lives inside a rock, present necessary, completely unremarkable to anything looking from the outside. He was heading for the Fort Greene warming shelter on Decatur Avenue. It was the kind of place that kept its doors open until 3 in the morning on weeknights and smelled permanently of industrial cleaner and accumulated human exhaustion. But it was warm, and warm was the only adjective that mattered on a night like this one, when the temperature had dropped below 20 and the wind off the river was doing things to expose skin that he preferred not to dwell on. He had maybe 40 minutes to get there before capacity locked him out until morning. He knew the walk. He had done it before twice in the last month. Crossed the bridge, cut through Brooklyn Heights, down Flatbush, left on Decatur. 4 turns, mechanical. The kind of route that lets your feet handle the business while your mind goes somewhere less cold. Somewhere it can rest for a few minutes from the constant work of being alert. His mind was somewhere else entirely when he heard it. Not a sound he could name immediately. Not a crash. A crash had a beginning and an end and a quality of impact that this did not have. Not a horn, not the distant mechanical language of the bridge at night that he had learned to tune out the way you tune out ambient noise in any environment you inhabit long enough. Something underneath all of that. Something that cut through the wind in the distant low hum of the city, the way a blade cuts through water, clean and sudden and wrong, in a way his nervous system registered before his brain had finished processing what it was. A sound that didn't fit the grammar of the bridge at 2 in the morning, a sound that said something has changed in the last 30 seconds and you need to pay attention to what. He stopped walking. Every instinct he had spent 7 months sharpening on the streets of Brooklyn fired at the same moment simultaneously like a circuit completing. He turned toward the sound before any conscious decision had been made about turning, before the thinking part of his mind had caught up with the part that had already understood. Through the fog, maybe 60 feet ahead, he saw the motorcycle. A Harley-Davidson Heritage Classic, or what was left of one, the chrome and leather of it reduced by circumstance to something that communicated damage more than anything else. It was jammed at a brutal angle against a section of bridge railing that had clearly been compromised by something before tonight, the metal already bent outward at a point 6 feet from where the bike now rested, the structural integrity of that section, already in conversation with gravity about which of them was going to win. The front wheel of the bike was over the edge, spinning slowly in the open air above 130 feet of black, freezing East River. The chrome caught the bridge lights and threw them back wrong, scattered and refracted like light reflected off broken glass rather than whole glass. The difference was small. It was the kind of difference that meant something. The bike groaned against the metal the way something alive groans when it is in pain and running out of the energy required to keep expressing that pain. And the weight of it was shifting. Not dramatically, not all at once, incrementally in the way that catastrophe often arrives inch by terrible inch below the threshold of the dramatic accumulating toward the point where incrementally stops being a word that applies and becomes something else entirely. Reed saw her a half second after he saw the bike. She was pinned beneath the handlebars on the walkway side, one hand gripping the railing with the white-knuckled desperation of someone whose grip strength has been elevated from a physical capability to a philosophical position, the only argument she has left to make against the river below. Her other hand was pressed against a gash above her left eye that had been painting her face red long enough that the red had begun to dry at the edges, darker at the margins, still bright at the center, where it continued to move. Her helmet was gone. Somewhere behind her on the bridge, or already in the river below. Somewhere the wind had taken it. No way to know which. Her head was bare in the February cold, in a way that registered as wrong before anything else about the situation did. She couldn't have been older than 17. Her eyes were half open, moving in the slow, unfocused way of someone whose body has begun making autonomous decisions about which systems to prioritize and which to let drift. Consciousness was somewhere on the list, but not at the top of it anymore. Her lips were moving. Something might have been coming out of them. The wind coming off the East River was taking everything tonight and giving none of it back. Reed looked left. He looked right. A single car had slowed 50 yards back on the vehicle lane, hazard lights blinking orange in the fog, slow and rhythmic, the universal signal for, I see that something is wrong, and I have chosen to be stationary rather than involved. Nobody was getting out. Nobody was running. Nobody was doing anything except watching through glass, warm and safe and locked in the particular human paralysis that takes hold when a situation is large enough and strange enough that the mind stalls on the prior question, who is supposed to handle this, before it can reach the actual question of what to do. The bystander effect. He'd read about it once in a psychology textbook someone had left on a bench in Prospect Park. He'd understood it intellectually. He had not understood it the way he understood it, now watching the hazard lights blink. Nobody else was going to handle this. The calculation was simple. The calculation took approximately 1 second. He dropped his backpack on the walkway, the compass, the socks, the sketchbook in its rubber band, all of it hitting the concrete, and he was already moving before the bag had finished settling. He grabbed the railing with both hands, and the cold of it burned through his palms immediately. The metal at this hour and this temperature, having acquired something beyond coldness, something that communicated damage rather than mere discomfort. He threw one leg over the outside of the railing, then the other, and then there was nothing beneath his feet except the lowest rung of the guardrail and 130 feet of dark air and darker water, and the particular quality of stillness that exists in the space between a decision and its consequences. The wind hit him from three directions simultaneously when he cleared the walkway side. His fingers went numb in the first 15 seconds. Not gradually. All at once, the way sensation leaves extremities when the conditions exceed a certain threshold, as though the body has made a decision about resource allocation and the fingers didn't make the cut. His sneakers had no grip on the railing's outer frame. The hole above the left toe made everything worse, the metal finding his skin directly conducting cold in the most efficient way possible. He pressed himself flat against the outside of the guardrail and moved laterally toward her, hand over hand, not looking down the metal vibrating under his grip. Every time the motorcycle shifted its weight against the railing, each shift a small announcement of the physics involved. She saw him when he was about 4 feet away. Her eyes found his, and something moved through them that was not quite hope. Hope requires a clarity of mind she no longer had full access to, requires the cognitive resources to construct a future that is better than the present, and those resources were being spent elsewhere, but something that lived in the same neighborhood as hope, something adjacent to it. The decision made in some wordless and ancient part of her to hold on for one more minute because something was happening in the immediate environment that had not been happening 30 seconds ago, and the part of her that was still operating on instinct understood that this mattered. He reached her. He got one arm under hers, got his grip around her, felt the full dead weight of her, and the full not dead weight of the bike pulling against him simultaneously. The physics of the situation organized entirely against him, as though the river below had already made its decision and was simply waiting with the patience of moving water on the formality of its fulfillment. He pulled. His sneakers found no grip on the lower rung of the railing. His arms had no real strength, not the kind of strength that comes from being fed adequately and sleeping adequately and existing in conditions that allow a body to build and maintain the musculature that moments like this require. He had been eating one real meal a day when he could get it for 7 months. His arms knew this. What he had instead was something that does not have a clean name in any language, that he knew something that lives below the level of muscle and bone and training and preparation in a place most people spend their entire lives without ever needing to access, because most lives most of the time do not require it. He pulled from that place, and she moved a fraction of an inch, then another fraction. The motorcycle groaned and tilted further, and for one single second that stretched longer than a second, should be able to stretch the entire weight of it, transferred through her body into his arms. He felt his fingers begin to slip from the railing. The cold had reduced them to something that barely functioned as fingers that had lost the precision and the strength that fingers are supposed to have and was operating on something below that something more fundamental. He thought with the strange and specific clarity that seems to exist only at the absolute edge of things, at the point where the mind stops doing anything except being completely present in the moment. He thought that this was how it ended. Not in Pittsburgh, not in some parking lot or shelter corridor or dark street. On a bridge in February, trying to do the thing that was obviously the right thing to do, failing at it, and going over the edge with a girl he'd never met. It did not end. He found another half-inch of grip somewhere that he would never be able to locate or explain afterwards, some reserve below the reserves, some last account he hadn't known he had. He planted his left foot against a bolt in the railing's lower frame, the metal finding the exact gap in his shoe where the sole had separated, and he pulled one final time with the entirety of what he was. They fell backward onto the walkway together, Reed flat on his back. The girl collapsed across him, both of them breathing in the ragged, desperate, grateful way of people who have just negotiated with something that had no obligation to let them win and had let them win anyway. Behind them, freed of her weight, the Harley tipped silently over the edge of the bridge. The fall lasted long enough that Reed had time to hear the wind moving around it as it fell before the impact came up from below, a distant final crash that echoed once off the stone and steel of the bridge supports and then was swallowed completely by the river, as though the river had been waiting for it, and accepted it without drama, without comment, the way water accepts everything that is given to it eventually. He lay on his back staring up at the pale yellow bridge lights and the fog moving slowly across them. The fog that never stopped moving, that existed in a permanent state of crossing from one side of the river to the other. His hands were shaking. Not from cold, or not only from cold, from whatever had just happened in his arms and his shoulders, from the aftermath of pulling from that place below the reserves. His left shoulder felt like something inside it had been quietly rearranged during the process. Some structural element shifted from its original position. The cold was so total that he could not determine with any precision where his body ended and the night began. The girl was breathing beside him, slow, shallow, but breathing. Somewhere in the direction of Brooklyn, he could hear sirens beginning rising from the ambient noise of the city into something deliberate, something directed. An MTA bus driver who had watched the entire sequence from the opposite lane had already made the call before Reed had gotten both feet back over the railing. The sound was distant, but it was getting less distant with each breath. Reed sat up. He looked at her. The blood above her eye had continued, and he pressed the sleeve of his windbreaker against the gash and held it there with steady pressure. And she turned her face slightly toward the pressure, the way injured people do when the body is operating on its own intelligence and has temporarily suspended input from higher functions. Her lips moved. This time the wind did not take it. This time the words came through. She said her last name. One word. Barely more than a breath shaped into a syllable by lips that were already losing their color in the February air. Voss. Reed heard it, and the response was immediate and total. Every hair on the back of his neck standing up simultaneously, a physical response that preceded any cognitive processing of the information, the body registering the significance before the mind had assembled the implications. Because he knew that name. Not the way you know a name from a news story read on a screen in a library. Not the way you know a name from something overheard and half-processed and filed somewhere in the back of memory. The way you know a name when you have spent 7 months living in the margins of Brooklyn and Newark, and the peripheral spaces of 3 states where that name functions as a kind of weather. Something you learn to read in the atmosphere of a room, in the way a conversation changes register when it gets close to certain territory, in the specific quality of silence that falls over a group of people when a name comes up that everyone in the room understands they should treat carefully. Voss was not just a name, it was a signal, a territorial marker, a declaration made not through words, but through 2 decades of consistent, unambiguous action about exactly what kind of man stood behind it and exactly what kind of world he had built, and what happened to things that came into contact with that world without adequate preparation or respect. Raymond Voss. Steel to the people who rode with him and to the people who understood what riding with him meant. President of a Hells Angels chapter based in Newark, New Jersey, that had operated for 19 years with the kind of organizational discipline that would have been the envy of institutions far more respectable and far less honest about what they were. The sirens were getting closer. Reed sat with his sleeve pressed against the cut above her eye, and he looked at her face in the yellow light, and he held the weight of the name she had just given him alongside everything else he was already carrying, and he made a calculation that took less than 5 seconds. He stood up. He picked up his backpack from where he had dropped it, felt the familiar weight of it settle onto his shoulders, felt the rubber band on the sketchbook through the fabric of the bag, the way he always could, the small specific pressure of it. And he walked into the fog in the direction opposite to the sirens, moving with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who has ordinary business on the other side of this bridge, someone the city would recognize as unremarkable without needing to look twice. Not running. He had learned through a specific and memorable incident in October that running was the wrong speed. Running said there is a reason I am not walking. Walking said I am part of the city. Walking said I belong here, and the question of where I am going is uninteresting. He walked. By the time the first patrol car crossed onto the Brooklyn Bridge pedestrian approach, the walkway held one girl, one damaged section of railing, and the faint impression of 2 shoe prints pressed into the frost of the walkway. One of them, slightly irregular in shape, slightly open at the toe, already being erased by the February wind, already being reclaimed by the cold. The boy was gone. But the name was still in his ears, and it would not leave, and names like that one do not leave without taking something with them. He moved through Brooklyn Heights at the pace he had practiced for 7 months. The pace that was invisible because it was the pace of someone who belonged here, who had somewhere ordinary to be, who would be unremarkable to any camera or officer or witness. He moved through the heights and into Flatbush and east toward Bushwick, with the sirens receding behind him and the city coming alive in the slow, reluctant way that cities come alive at 3 in the morning, when there is something to come alive about, when the scanners have started carrying traffic that pulls certain people out of bed and toward windows. He reached the warming shelter on Myrtle Avenue with 30 minutes to spare before the overnight coordinator, a heavy-set woman named Gloria, who had been running the place for 9 years and who asked fewer questions than almost anyone Reed had encountered in 7 months of needing people to ask fewer questions before Gloria would begin the process of managing capacity for the next shift. He found his corner near the radiator. He set his backpack against the wall and wedged himself between it and the corner the way he always did, so that any contact with the bag would register before he was fully awake. He pulled his jacket over his face. He did not know, as he settled into the shallow and alert negotiation with consciousness that passed for sleep in places like this, that in a repair shop in Newark, New Jersey, a phone was already ringing. Not a business line, not the charter phone. The one that lived in Raymond Steele Voss's left inside pocket, the one with a number known to exactly 4 people on Earth, the one that had never rung during a meeting in 19 years of meetings. He felt it before he heard it, a single vibration against his chest, while 8 men sat around a table in a back room that smelled of motor oil and cold coffee, and the particular density of conversations that leave no written record. He looked at the screen. He stood up and walked to the corner of the room before he answered, which communicated everything that needed to be communicated to the 7 other men at the table, without a single word being exchanged. In 19 years, he had never walked to the corner to answer a call. The conversation lasted 40 seconds. Steele said nothing for the first 30 of them. He listened with the stillness of a man who has learned that stillness is not the absence of response, but a specific kind of response, that the quality of your listening communicates as much as the quality of your speaking. He asked one question in the final 10 seconds. Then he ended the call and stood facing the corner wall for a moment that stretched itself into its own kind of statement, a pause that was doing work. When he turned around, his face was composed, deliberately carefully composed the way a man composes himself when the alternative is something he has decided at a level below conscious decision-making that he will not permit in front of other people. He sat back down. He set the phone face down on the table. He said nothing. The silence that followed lasted 8 seconds. Briggs Malone, who had been riding with Steele Voss for 19 years and who had seen him navigate situations that would have fractured most men before they'd even understood what was happening, counted those 8 seconds later privately because those 8 seconds stayed with him, the way certain silences do carried in the memory, not as an absence of sound, but as a presence, as something that had weight and texture and communicated more than speech could have. Not the silence of a man thinking, the silence of a man deciding what kind of man he was going to be in the next 60 seconds, deciding in the most fundamental sense which version of himself to bring into whatever came next. When Steele finally spoke, his voice was level, each word placed down with care, like something fragile set on a surface you're not sure will hold it. He named a location. He named a time. He said 2 words, full colors. Then he looked at Briggs and said one more thing quietly, the words not reaching the far end of the table. Briggs nodded once and left the room immediately with the unhurried directness of someone who has received a clear instruction and has no questions about it. Within 20 minutes, 7 phones rang across 7 cities: Newark, Trenton, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Albany, Hartford, Providence. Each call lasted under a minute. Each person who received one asked no questions. Not because they were incurious, but because some calls carry their own context, and the context of this particular call, the hour, the number calling, the brevity of the instruction said everything that needed to be said about the nature of the situation. By 3:30 in the morning, encrypted messages were moving between chapter officers up and down the eastern seaboard, and men who had been asleep in beds, in houses in 7 cities, were getting up in the dark and pulling on leather and checking fuel gauges and moving with the quiet, focused efficiency of people responding to something they had always understood might come. 220 men, 7 cities, 1 location, 1 time. No explanation offered, none required. By 4 in the morning, the first signals reached the outside world. A police scanner in lower Manhattan caught radio traffic near the New Jersey approaches that didn't fit the ordinary pattern of the hour. A reporter named Cass Merritt, working an overnight shift and monitoring 3 scanners simultaneously because she had been doing it for 6 years and had never been able to stop, caught the edge of it. She posted 2 careful sentences. She wasn't certain yet what she was looking at. She was certain enough to flag it. By 4:15, her post had been shared 1,100 times. By 4:30, the NYPD's Joint Operations Center had opened an active threat assessment file, which meant that a specific category of institutional attention had been directed at something that had not yet revealed its full shape. The FBI's instruction to the NYPD came through channels at 4:17 in the morning. 4 words: do not engage them. The deputy commissioner asked for the instruction to be repeated. It was repeated. He asked for the reason behind it. The reason had nothing to do with 220 motorcycles crossing into Brooklyn at dawn. It had everything to do with a 16-year-old boy who had walked off the Brooklyn Bridge into the February fog 90 minutes earlier and had not been identified and had not been found, and who was, according to a file that the deputy commissioner was only now being made aware, existed the most significant active federal witness in a case that had been running for over a year out of the Western District of Pennsylvania. In the warming shelter on Myrtle Avenue, Reed Calloway slept without knowing any of this. He slept without knowing that his name was in a federal file that had just caused a deputy police commissioner to ask for something to be repeated. He slept without knowing that the girl he had pulled from the railing was already in a hospital bed 3 miles away. He slept without knowing that the name she had whispered into the February air had set in motion something that was at this moment moving through 7 cities simultaneously toward a single point. He was just a boy trying to get through the night. He was also the only person alive who could end something that a great many powerful and dangerous people had spent 14 months ensuring could not be ended, which is where the story actually begins. Not on the bridge in February, though the bridge is where it becomes visible. Not in the meeting room in Newark, though the meeting room is where it becomes something with weight and consequence. It begins 9 months earlier and 400 miles away, in a life that still had walls and heat, and a mother and the ordinary textures of a life being lived forward rather than survived backward. Pittsburgh, the Homewood neighborhood specifically, which occupies a specific place in the geography of the city, residential, historically black, carrying its own dignity alongside its own difficulties, the kind of neighborhood that produces people who understand things about endurance and community that more comfortable places never have occasion to learn. A narrow apartment on Homewood Avenue, 2nd floor, with a front window that faced a vacant lot where someone had planted an ambitious garden 3 summers ago, and then gradually over the following 2 summers let it return to its own devices, and a back window that faced the yard of the neighbors. The Freemans, who had maintained their garden through what appeared to be sheer stubborn affection, and who produced more tomatoes every August than 4 people could reasonably eat, and left paper bags of them on the stoop of every building within 100 yards. No note, no expectation of acknowledgement. Nora Calloway worked double shifts at UPMC Presbyterian on the other side of the city. Floor nurse, cardiac ward. She had been doing it for 11 years since Reed was 5, since his father, a man named Owen Calloway, who had died before Reed was old enough to have formed any memory of him. Or so Nora had always said, in the quiet, final way that she said things she had decided were finished was no longer part of the equation in any way she was willing to discuss. She made enough. They managed. The apartment was small and the heat in winter was unreliable in the specific way that heat in old buildings is unreliable, working perfectly until the temperature dropped below a certain point at which the system seemed to make a philosophical objection. And the neighborhood had its history and its difficulties the way all neighborhoods do, but it was theirs. That word theirs carried a weight that Reed did not fully understand until the night it stopped being accurate. He was by any measure that his teachers used a quiet kid. Not shy, not withdrawn, not unhappy in any way that required intervention. Internal. The kind of internal that expresses itself not through conversation but through observation, through the careful noticing of things that other people move past without pausing. He noticed things. Faces specifically. He had been noticing faces since he was young enough to notice anything, had been fascinated by the specific and unrepeatable way that each human face communicated something beyond the obvious, something that lived in the small muscles around the eyes and in the set of the jaw and in the accumulated weight of all the expressions a person had ever made, which eventually left their record in the face, the way water leaves its record in stone. He drew those faces. He had been drawing them since he was 9 years old when Nora had brought home a set of charcoal pencils from a church rummage sale for $3, a spontaneous purchase, something she'd picked up without a specific plan, and he had filled every piece of paper in the apartment within 2 weeks. By 13, he had developed what his 8th grade art teacher, a tired woman named Ms. Broward, who had been underestimating her students for 15 years, and occasionally briefly stopped doing so, called an uncanny eye for emotional specificity. By 15, he was drawing strangers everywhere on the bus in the park outside the library. Never asking permission, never showing them the result. Just capturing the specific way a specific human face held a specific moment in time, and carrying that moment in the sketchbook afterward, a private archive of the world as it actually looked when nobody was performing. He drew faces the way other people took photographs, to hold on to things, to make sure they didn't dissolve into the blur of time before he'd had a chance to understand what he'd seen. The night of May 14th, Reed was cutting through the Strip District waterfront on his way back from a friend's apartment on Penn Avenue. Marcus Webb, who he'd known since 6th grade, who lived 3 streets off Penn with his grandmother in a row house that smelled of cooking, and had a refrigerator that was always stocked in a way that Reed had learned not to look at directly because it communicated something about the difference between their situations that he preferred not to dwell on. It was a route he had taken many times faster than the bus, and it was a warm May night, and he was 16, and time felt abundant in the specific way it feels abundant before the world has had occasion to teach you what it actually costs. He saw the meeting through a gap in the loading dock fencing. There was a section of chain link near the 3rd loading dock on River Avenue where the fence had been pushed inward by something years ago and never repaired, leaving a gap about 8 inches wide between 2 posts. A person standing at the right angle on the sidewalk could see through it clearly into the dock area below the street level. Reed was not looking for anything through any gap. He was walking, and his mind was doing what it did on familiar routes, which was wander through the internal sketchbook of faces. The man from the bus on Tuesday, the woman outside the library, who had been crying without making any sound, the old man on Butler Street, who sat on the same bench every morning and had the most extraordinary face Reed had ever seen. A face that seemed to contain the full record of a long life spent mostly outdoors. He happened to look through the gap at the wrong moment, or the right one, depending on how you account for these things. 3 men. 2 of them wore leather cuts, the kind with patches that communicated specific things to people who understood the vocabulary of patches and communicated something more general but equally clear to people who didn't. He registered this without fully processing it, the way you register background detail when your attention is not yet focused. The 3rd man wore a dark jacket, no cuts, no patches, nothing that announced an affiliation. He carried himself with a kind of institutional stillness that Reed would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately, and would eventually settle on this formulation: the stillness of a man who has spent years learning to make himself unreadable as a professional skill, and who is so practiced at the unreadability that the practice itself has become the most readable thing about him. The stillness of someone who is always underneath the surface calculating. The man in the dark jacket was handing something to one of the leather-cut men. A case, sealed, passed with the brisk, efficient quality of a transaction that has been completed many times before and has long since shed whatever weight it might have carried the first time it was done. Reed stood at the gap for 40 seconds. He would come to know it was 40 seconds because he would replay those 40 seconds so many times over the following 9 months in shelter beds in the hours before dawn, in the specific kind of wakefulness that comes when the mind refuses to stop working, that he would eventually be able to account for every second individually. What he was seeing, what he was thinking, what his feet were doing, which was staying still when they should have been moving, what he understood in each of those 40 seconds, which was, this is something I am not supposed to be seeing, and then I should have kept walking. And then I need to walk now. In the 38th second, the man in the dark jacket turned his head, not toward the street in general, toward the fence line, toward the specific gap in the chain link, toward the exact point where a 16-year-old boy was standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and his mind suddenly entirely catastrophically present in the moment. Their eyes met through 8 inches of bent chain link in the Strip District of Pittsburgh on a warm May night. Reed walked away, not running. He understood immediately, and without needing to think about it, that running would communicate exactly what he needed to not communicate. He walked with a controlled casualness that cost him everything he had and got him 4 blocks before the shaking started in his legs. Bad enough that he put both hands against the brick wall of a laundromat and waited, watching the brick breathing, until the shaking became something he could work with rather than something working him. He did not sleep that night. He did not tell Nora. He told himself that he had not seen anything clearly identifiable, which was partially true. He told himself that nothing would come of it, which was the thing he needed to believe in order to continue existing in the apartment on Homewood Avenue without becoming something that couldn't function. It turned out to be the most expensive belief he had ever maintained. 3 days later, 2 federal investigators knocked on the door at 10 in the morning. Nora was home between shifts. Reed sat at the kitchen table and listened to them explain over the course of 2 hours that he would remember in granular detail for years afterward the shape of the situation he had walked into through a gap in a chain-link fence. The case was layered. Infrastructure fraud across 4 states: Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Maryland, running through legitimate city contracts, money moving through municipal procurement systems with such thoroughness that every thread an investigator followed led back to something that looked from the outside like ordinary government business. Federal investigators had been circling the structure for 22 months without finding the point of entry, the loose thread, the single thing that could be pulled to begin unraveling the whole. Then a 16-year-old boy stood at a fence line for 40 seconds. The man in the dark jacket was named Carl Whitmore, Deputy U.S. Marshal, Pittsburgh Field Office, 9 years in position, security clearance that gave him access to witness protection arrangements, case file contents, protection timetables, the internal geography of the federal case against the network he was supposedly helping to prosecute. Reed's identification of Whitmore at that specific location on that specific night made the entire prosecution structurally viable in a way that it currently, without Reed's testimony, was not. A witness protection arrangement was activated within 72 hours. It collapsed within 48. Reed would never know the exact mechanism of the collapse. What he would know was its consequence. On a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after the investigators' visit, 2 men approached Nora outside the entrance to UPMC Presbyterian as she was leaving a shift. No words were spoken. The communication was physical and lasted less than a minute, and left her with a fractured right wrist and 3 cracked ribs on the left side, and a specific, complete, and perfectly communicated understanding of what the communication was in response to and what it would escalate into if Reed Calloway did not remove himself from the situation. She called him from the floor of the hospital parking structure before she called 911, before she called anyone else. Her voice on the phone was controlled in the way that people who have worked emergency medicine for 11 years learn to be controlled in impossible circumstances, controlled even when the impossible circumstance is their own body, broken on concrete, controlled even when the footsteps of the people who put it there are still fading in the structure above. She said 4 things to him. She told him what had happened to her. She told him that they had found the protection arrangement, which meant someone inside it had told them, which meant there was no version of the federal system that was safe. She told him she would be all right, which she believed was more true than not at that moment, and which turned out to be true eventually. And she told him to run. Not to the police, not to the federal investigators, north, away, fast. She told him she loved him in the specific way that parents say that phrase, in moments when they cannot be certain how many more opportunities they will have to say it. Then she ended the call and dialed 911. Reed stood in the apartment on Homewood Avenue for 11 minutes. He was not paralyzed. He was packing methodically the way someone packs when they understand that this is the last time they will be doing this particular thing in this particular place, and they want to do it correctly. Socks. The broken compass, which he paused over for a moment before putting in. Not because he thought it would be useful, but because leaving it felt like a surrender he wasn't ready to make. The sketchbook. He stood at the back window for 60 seconds and looked at the Freeman's garden in the late spring dark. Everything coming up green, and determined the tomato plants already knee-high on their stakes. And then he shouldered the backpack and walked out the front door and did not look back at the apartment because he understood in his body that looking back was a cost he could not pay right now. He went north. It was the direction that felt most like distance from what was behind him. He crossed into New Jersey, then into New York, moving through the geography of the eastern seaboard, the way water moves through a landscape, finding the passages that don't require documentation, The roots that accept you without asking you to prove you belong there. He had $73 when he left Pittsburgh, and he made them last with the concentrated frugality of someone for whom there would be no replacement if they ran out. 7 months. Brooklyn mostly. The shelter system when there was space in it, the streets when there wasn't, the margins of a city that contained multitudes and paid attention to very few of them. And somewhere in those 7 months, somewhere in the September gold of a particular afternoon, when the city had briefly remembered that it could be beautiful, he saw her. He did not know who she was. He was sitting on a bench on the promenade in Brooklyn Heights on a September afternoon that New York had produced as though an apology for August, all gold light and bearable temperature, and the bridge hung in the background like an image of itself, like the idea of a bridge rendered in steel and cable. He was doing what he did, sketchbook, open watching faces. She came around the curve of the promenade at the pace that teenagers move when they have too much energy for stillness, but no particular destination. Fast, a little uncontained, entirely themselves. Dark jacket, hair pulled back. Something in the expression that stopped him in the middle of a thought and held him there. A specific quality of alertness, the kind that belongs to people who are accustomed to being aware of their surroundings. And underneath the alertness, something else. Something he didn't have a word for, but recognized as the expression a person makes when they believe nobody is watching them closely enough to matter. The expression of someone being entirely themselves. He drew her from memory that evening in the shelter common room. It took him 40 minutes to get it right, the angle of the jaw, the specific quality of what was in her eyes. The thing underneath the alertness that he still couldn't name but could render in charcoal if he worked at it long enough. When he finished, he wrote the date in the lower right corner the way he always did. September 19th, 5 months before the night on the bridge. He did not know her name. He had no reason to know her name. He did not know that she was Elena Voss, 17 years old, daughter of Raymond Steele Voss, a man whose name Reed would hear for the first time 4.5 months later, in circumstances that neither of them would have believed if someone had described them in advance. He put the rubber band around the sketchbook and put it in the backpack and did not think about it again for 5 months. Not until the moment on the bridge when he pressed his sleeve against the cut above her eye and she said Voss into the February wind, and something in him recognized something he could not yet articulate. Not just the name, but a connection that ran beneath the name, a thread between a September afternoon and a February night that suggested the universe had a grammar he had not yet learned to read. He did not stay on the bridge long enough to finish the thought. He walked into the fog. And in Newark, the engines were starting. The sound arrived before the image did. That was the thing people said afterward when they tried to describe it to people who had not been there, tried and usually failed, because the experience of it was not primarily visual, and the language most available to people for describing powerful experiences is primarily visual. The sound, a low, sustained vibration that traveled across the harbor in the cold morning air of a Brooklyn February and arrived in the body before it was processed by the ear. Something felt in the chest before heard by the ear. Something that communicated in a frequency below ordinary speech, below the register of language, in the register of something older. People on the Brooklyn waterfront who had gathered in the preceding hour turned toward it instinctively. Some of them were in coats thrown over pajamas. Some had never gone to bed. Some had woken to alerts on their phones and come outside without fully deciding to pulled by the specific gravity that unusual events exert on people who live near them. They turned toward the sound the way crowds always turn toward things that communicate in pre-linguistic frequencies before the rational mind has had time to contextualize what is happening. The fog was still heavy off the East River at 5:44 in the morning, thick enough to hold the convoy invisible for 40 full seconds after the sound of it had already arrived. 40 seconds of that low building vibration growing in the chest while the eyes searched the gray and found nothing to attach it to. And then the lights came through first. Not dramatically, not all at once. A long, unbroken line of headlights materializing out of the fog slowly, steadily, without theater, without any acknowledgement of the 3 news helicopters repositioning above, or the several hundred people holding something collectively along the waterfront, or the NYPD units maintaining their careful distance on the approaches. The lights coming through the gray like something emerging from a different condition of the world, from somewhere the fog was permanent rather than temporary. 220 motorcycles, 6 columns wide, moving in a formation so precise it communicated something beyond discipline, something about collective decision, about 220 individual choices. that had converged into a single direction and were now expressing that convergence in chrome and leather and the synchronized exhaust of engines that had been running since before dawn. The spacing between each motorcycle identical. The speed uniform across all 6 columns. Each rider sitting straight unhurried, absorbed into the rhythm of the whole, in the way that individual musicians disappear into an orchestra when everything is working the way it is supposed to work. Leather cuts with death's head patches caught the pale morning light at the same angle simultaneously. Chrome caught the bridge lights above in the same moment across 220 surfaces. The exhaust of 220 engines rose into the cold morning air in a single continuous cloud that drifted east over the river, indifferent to its own significance. Simply warm air meeting cold air and doing what warm air does when it meets cold. The crowd on the waterfront made a sound. Not a cheer, not a scream, not applause or protest or any of the sounds that crowds make when they have processed what they are seeing and arrived at a response. Something involuntary and collective and low. Something that comes from below the level of decision from the part of a person that responds to scale before the rational mind has time to name what it is responding to. Something that said, this is real and it is large and I do not yet understand what it means, but I understand that it is significant in a way that demands something from me, even if I don't yet know what. 3 news helicopters tracked them from above, cameras transmitting live to stations that had preempted their morning programming without discussion. A producer in a Midtown studio said later that it was the easiest call she had made in 11 years. You don't cut away from 220 Hells Angels riding in formation through Brooklyn at dawn. You clear the desk and you watch and you let the images do whatever work they are going to do. The convoy moved through Bay Ridge, through Sunset Park, through Carroll Gardens and Dumbo, the streets clearing ahead of them through a combination of the early hour and something else, something that is not exactly fear but is related to fear. The instinct that empties a path for something that is large and moving with intention, the instinct that has always done this, that predates the rational assessment of threat, and simply acts on the information that something significant is coming and that the path should be clear. NYPD units shadowed at the careful distance that the federal instruction had specified, close enough to be present far enough to communicate a particular message about what kind of presence this was. Officers in those units reported afterward independently the same observation, the discipline. There was no aggression in the convoy, no theater, no acknowledgement of the cameras above, or the crowds along the route, or the police units matching their progress. Just 220 men moving toward a point with the focused certainty of people who have made a decision and are now doing the simple work of carrying it out. They reached the Brooklyn Bridge at 6:09 in the morning. The convoy slowed as it approached the section of walkway where the damaged guardrail still held the evidence of 7 hours ago. Bent metal scrape marks in the paint from the bike's impact. A dark stain in the frost that anyone who looked at directly understood immediately, without needing an explanation, without needing context. The lead motorcycle stopped at that exact point. The ones behind it stopped in sequence, a wave of stillness moving backward through the formation from front to rear motorcycle by motorcycle until all 220 engines died within 4 seconds of each other. The silence was catastrophic. That was the word a journalist used in her live broadcast and immediately second-guessed and then returned to because it was the only word available for what happened when something that large and that loud simply stopped the specific quality of silence that arrives when an enormous sound ceases and the world has not yet adjusted to the absence of it, when the silence is not just the absence of sound, but a presence of its own, something that has weight and temperature. The gathered crowd, hundreds of people deep along both bridge approaches, plus the cameras, plus the officers, plus residents in buildings overlooking the bridge entrance, who had opened their windows despite the cold to hear. Better held that silence the way you hold something you've been handed unexpectedly, unsure of its weight, not yet certain how to put it down. Raymond Steele Voss dismounted alone. He handed nothing to anyone. He said nothing to anyone. He swung off his motorcycle with the unhurried movement of a man who is entirely alone with his purpose and has been alone with it since the phone rang at 2:47 in the morning and has no need to perform any aspect of it for any audience. He walked to the damaged section of guardrail. He stopped in front of it. He looked at the bent metal, at the scrape marks, at the dark stain in the frost. He was a big man, broad through the chest and shoulders, built like someone the physical world has tested many times, and who has many times declined to be broken by those tests. The scar that ran from his left ear toward the corner of his jaw was old enough that it had long since become simply part of his face, the way certain geographical features become simply part of a landscape rather than events that happen to it. He reached out and placed both palms flat against the damaged section of railing, against the exact piece of metal that had held 7 hours ago the weight of his daughter and the weight of a boy he had never met, while 130 feet of frozen darkness waited below both of them. He bowed his head. 220 men behind him. Not one moved, not one spoke. The helicopters held altitude. The cameras continued. The crowd along the bridge approach achieved something rare in large groups of people, genuine collective silence chosen, rather than impose the silence of people who understood without being able to fully articulate why that this particular moment required it. He stayed that way for 90 seconds. It was the most watched 90 seconds of silence in New York that year. People who saw it live and people who watched the footage hours or days later described the same experience. The sense that the 90 seconds lasted longer than 90 seconds and that something was happening inside them during it that they could not immediately name but felt with a completeness that surprised them. When he lifted his head and straightened his back, something in the quality of the air on that bridge shifted in a way that the cameras caught but could not fully transmit. He turned to face his men. He looked at them for a moment, simply looked the way a man looks at something he trusts without reservation. Then he gave one single nod. What happened next dismantled every assumption every person watching had spent the preceding 6 hours carefully constructing. Toolboxes came off saddlebags, not weapons, not anything that confirmed any part of the threat assessment that had been running since 4 in the morning in the Joint Operations Center. Toolboxes, work gloves pulled on over hands that had been still during the entire convoy. Welding equipment emerging from 3 modified cargo vans that had been trailing the convoy vehicles that the media coverage had not paid adequate attention to, had categorized as support vehicles without considering what they might be supporting. Steel plating, industrial cleaning supplies. Replacement guardrail components that had been measured, cut, and prepared before dawn, before the convoy had left Newark, to the exact specifications of the damaged section, prepared with the exactness of something that had been thought through, planned, not improvised. 220 Hells Angels went to work on the Brooklyn Bridge. The silence broke then, but it broke into the sound of tools and metal and men working with the focused efficiency of a crew that knows exactly what it is doing and has the materials to do it, and no interest in being observed while doing it. Not silence that broke into drama. Silence that broke into work. The live broadcast anchors stopped speaking for nearly 30 seconds. One of them, a veteran who had covered New York for more than 2 decades, eventually said, "I have covered this city for a long time, and I have no framework for what I am watching right now." The line was clipped and distributed and replayed thousands of times before the morning was over, not because it was eloquent, but because it was true. The footage hit every platform. The comment sections filled faster than the moderation systems could process the volume. People across the country watched 220 Hells Angels repair a bridge in the early morning light of a Brooklyn February and felt something shift inside their understanding of words they had thought they already understood, words like loyalty, words like honor, words like the specific kind of integrity that does not require anyone to be watching. But not everyone who was at the scene was watching the bridge. In the press area on the South Approach, a journalist named Cass Merritt, the same reporter who had been awake for 22 straight hours on professional instinct, who had flagged the convoy at 3:30 in the morning, who had learned in 6 years of covering federal crime before moving to general assignment, that the visible story and the actual story were not always the same story, was not looking up at the bridge. She was sitting in the mobile unit with her laptop open and 3 database tabs running and a security footage file on her screen, a file released to credentialed media 2 hours earlier as standard incident documentation from the events on the bridge the night before. She had been cross-referencing it with federal missing persons records in a publicly accessible witness database for 40 minutes, doing the methodical and unglamorous background work that most journalists at a scene like this one had set aside in favor of the camera-ready story unfolding 50 yards above them. Cass had a conviction developed over 6 years of covering cases where the visible surface and the underlying structure diverged significantly, that the real story was not on the bridge. The facial recognition query she had run returned a result 11 minutes ago. She had been reading it since, reading it and rereading it with the careful attention of someone who wants to be absolutely certain they understand what they are looking at before they do anything with it, because what they are looking at does not fit the story that everyone is writing. The boy in the security footage, the one who had appeared on the bridge at 2 in the morning, pulled Elena Voss from 130 feet of nothing with his bare hands and then walked into the fog before a single officer got close enough to identify him, had returned a match in the database. But not to a missing child report, not to a runaway alert, not to anything that fit the narrative that was already being assembled about a nameless homeless teenager who had done something extraordinary in the middle of the night and then disappeared into the city. The match was flagged at the federal level. Restricted access. The file locked after 2 screens. But 2 screens was enough for someone who knew what they were reading. The boy was not a good Samaritan who had wandered into a moment. He was an active federal witness in a case out of the Western District of Pennsylvania that had been running for over a year. A case involving structures and actors that Cass recognized immediately that she understood the weight of, that she understood immediately were connected to things that were much larger than a bridge repair in Brooklyn on a February morning. She reached for her phone to call her editor. She stopped. Because in the reflection of her laptop screen in the dark surface of the window, behind her left shoulder, she saw something that her peripheral vision had been registering for several seconds without her conscious mind having attached it to anything actionable yet. A man, standing outside the mobile unit window, looking at her screen, not at the bridge, not at the convoy, at her screen, specifically at the angle and the proximity that told her he had been standing there long enough to read what was on it. Mid-40s, dark jacket, the build of someone who has maintained physical training over a long career. A face with the specific composed quality of someone who has spent years practicing unreadability and has become so accomplished at the practice that the composure itself is the most readable thing about him, readable to someone who knows what to look for. When their eyes met in the reflection, he did not look away. He smiled, a small smile, the specific kind of smile that means, I see that you see me, and I am not concerned about that, and I would like you to understand clearly that I am not concerned. Cass turned around. The space where he had been standing contained nothing, just the cold February air and the distant sound of tools on metal drifting down from the bridge above. She sat very still for a moment. Her nervous system was constructing an argument that her professional instincts were translating into something she could act on. She closed the laptop. She put it in her bag. She made 2 decisions at the same moment, the way certain high-clarity moments allow. The first, she was not going to mention what she had found to anyone. Not yet. Not until she understood who that man was and what his presence outside her window at that specific moment meant. The second, she was not going to remain alone in this press area for another second. She walked to the camera crew and the lights and the crowd, and she did not look behind her because she understood that looking behind her would confirm a fear she wasn't prepared yet to have confirmed, and that unconfirmed fears were more useful than confirmed ones because they left room to move. She filed a straightforward story about the convoy and the bridge repair. Factual, professional. No mention of the database result. No mention of the man outside the window. She kept the file. 3 weeks later, after things had resolved in ways she would eventually learn the shape of, she submitted a single paragraph to her editor. Not the federal file, not the name, not any of the things she had closed her laptop on at the bridge. Just a paragraph about a damaged guardrail and a repair crew that had arrived before dawn, and the particular quality of watching 220 people choose without anyone asking them to fix something that was not their responsibility. Her editor ran it without changes. It was the most read thing she had written in 4 years. She kept the other file. She was still waiting for the right moment. She had learned in 6 years of covering cases where timing was everything that the right moment had a specific quality when it arrived, and that you would know it. In the warming shelter on Myrtle Avenue, Reed Calloway had been awake for 40 minutes without moving. This was a skill he had developed specifically for shelter environments, the ability to be fully conscious, fully alert, fully processing the room while presenting externally as someone still asleep. In shelters, waking up visibly had social consequences. Not waking up visibly gave you time to assess the space before anyone in it knew you were assessing it. He had been doing this for 40 minutes because something in the room's atmosphere had changed, and his nervous system had registered the change and woken him before his conscious mind had identified what the change was. He kept his eyes closed and his breathing even, and he worked the room. The overnight coordinator, Gloria, at her desk near the entrance, The radiator doing its imperfect best. The usual mixture of bodies in various stages of exhaustion, the ambient sounds and smells of a space where people come when they have nowhere else to go. The institutional soap and the damp clothing and the accumulated human weight of difficulty that no amount of cleaning fully dispels. And the man sitting in a chair 3 feet away who had not been in that chair when Reed had fallen asleep. He was large, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the face of someone life has rearranged a few times and who has settled into the result without complaint. Dark jacket, work boots, no patches, no colors, nothing that announced an affiliation. But he didn't need announcement. Reed knew without being able to cite specific evidence what he was. Some categories of person communicate themselves clearly enough to people who have learned the language. Reed opened his eyes. Briggs Malone met them without surprise. He had been waiting for this. He reached into his jacket with 2 fingers, slowly, with the deliberate readability of someone who understands that the context of this moment requires every gesture to be unambiguous, and placed a phone on the floor between them. Screen facing up. A video call already connected. Reed looked at the screen. Raymond Steele Voss looked back at him. The older man's face was still, not hostile, not warm. The face of a man who is in the process of understanding something he needs to understand completely and accurately before he decides what it means and what he is going to do about it. He studied Reed with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who has spent a long career making assessments of people under difficult conditions and has learned to take whatever time those assessments require. Neither of them spoke. Then Briggs reached into his other pocket and placed 2 photographs on the floor beside the phone. The first a surveillance image, grainy and time-stamped, taken at the loading dock area of the Strip District waterfront in Pittsburgh on a May night 9 months ago. 3 men, 2 in leather cuts, and Carl Whitmore in his dark jacket face turned slightly toward the fence line, toward the gap in the chain link, toward the exact point where a 16-year-old boy had been standing. Reed's jaw tightened when he saw it. The tightening was involuntary. He didn't try to conceal it. Then Briggs placed the second photograph. This one was recent and clear, taken inside a building Reed recognized without needing to think about it because he was sitting in it. The man in the photograph was standing at the volunteer registration desk near the entrance in the middle of a group of other volunteers, presenting as unremarkable in the specific way that men like Carl Whitmore had learned to present as unremarkable. His shelter badge was visible. It read Pete Community Outreach. The timestamp read 11 days ago. Reed looked at the photograph for a long time. The radiator clicked. Gloria turned a page. Someone across the room shifted in their sleep. Then Briggs spoke for the first time, low, unhurried, carrying the specific weight of information delivered by someone who understands what it is going to cost the person receiving it. He said Pete's real name was Carl Whitmore, Deputy U.S. Marshal, Pittsburgh Field Office, and that Whitmore had arrived at this shelter 3 days after Reed had. Reed's eyes moved from the photographs to the shelter entrance. Carl Whitmore was standing in the doorway. Not Pete, not the practiced warmth of someone who volunteers because they care about community. Carl Whitmore in his operational configuration, focused, calculating, running a rapid assessment of the room. Exits, bodies, distances, variables. His right hand was already moving toward the inside of his jacket. The room felt it without seeing it. Conversations dropped. Eyes found plates. Bodies angled away from the entrance with the unconscious, practiced self-preservation of people who have learned that the distance between themselves and trouble is worth maintaining without having to think about why. Whitmore's hand stopped inside his jacket, not drawing, not retreating, waiting on the completion of a calculation. And then Reed stood up. Not Briggs, not the institutional weight arranged in this room, not the phone on the floor or the name on the screen. Reed Calloway pushed himself up from the corner near the radiator and straightened his back and looked at Carl Whitmore across 30 feet of shelter floor. He had no weapon. He had no authority that anyone in Whitmore's professional category would recognize as authority. He had a broken compass and a sketchbook with a rubber band around it, and 7 months of learning how to stand in a space without flinching, how to hold a room with nothing but the quality of his own stillness. He used all of it now. He looked at Whitmore the way he had learned to look at things he was afraid of, not with defiance, which is reactive and loud and communicates the fear underneath it, but with the specific quality of steadiness that belongs to someone who has already made their decision and is no longer available to be moved by pressure. The steadiness of someone who has been afraid for so long that the fear has become structural load-bearing and no longer has the power to make executive decisions. Briggs, still seated, reached into his own jacket and placed a second phone on the floor. Screen up, a live call. A single name displayed at the top of the screen. Whitmore read the name from the doorway. He was a man who had spent 14 months making calculations. He ran this one quickly from every angle he could find. The results were consistent. His hand came out of his jacket empty. He stood in the doorway for another moment, the specific stillness of a man absorbing a recalculation that has changed the fundamental shape of the problem. Then he turned and walked out of the shelter without a word and without hurrying, and the door closed behind him with the most ordinary sound in the world. A door in a building where doors close constantly, meaning nothing, adding nothing to the air. Reed let out a breath. He sat back down against the wall, and his hands were steady, which no longer surprised him the way it once would have, because steadiness, at a certain point, stops being an achievement and becomes simply the condition. Briggs said two things. He said what needed to happen next required a different room in a different city, and that Reed would need to decide in the next few minutes whether he was willing to go there. He said the decision was entirely Reed's to make, and that nothing that had happened in this room or any other room constituted pressure on that decision. It was the most honest thing anyone with any kind of power over his situation had said to Reed in 9 months. He said yes. They left through a side entrance on Myrtle Avenue into a gray February morning that was cold in the consistent, settled way of February in New York. Cold that has stopped being extreme and has simply become the prevailing condition, the baseline against which everything else is measured. A black SUV sat at the curb with its engine running. Reed got in. He didn't ask where it was going. He already knew. Newark. 37 minutes across the Goethals Bridge in morning traffic lighter than usual because a significant portion of the city's attention was pointed at a bridge in Brooklyn where 220 motorcycles were parked and 220 men were working. Reed watched the New Jersey shoreline come up through the window and thought about his mother in a hospital in Pittsburgh with her wrist in a cast and 3 cracked ribs. He thought about 40 seconds at a fence line. He thought about the drawing in the sketchbook with September 19th in the corner. He thought about what it meant that Briggs had come to the shelter rather than anywhere else, which meant Steele Voss had found him, which raised the question of how Steele Voss had found him, which opened onto questions he didn't yet have the information to answer. He thought about Whitmore reading the name on the phone screen and taking his hand out of his jacket empty. He did not think about what the room in Newark would contain because it was a room he had never been in and could not map from the outside. He had learned in 7 months of existing in unmappable spaces that the correct response to a room you can't map in advance is to walk through the door and assess what you find. The door was on the second floor of a Portuguese restaurant on Ferry Street in the Ironbound district, reached through a side entrance, and a narrow staircase, and a hallway, and then a room with no windows. 1 door and a table for 4. The kind of room that has existed in buildings in Newark and Philadelphia and Baltimore for a very long time, doing the work that rooms without windows do. Reed sat in a chair against the wall. Steele Voss sat on one side of the table. He was larger in person than on the phone screen, with the kind of presence that fills a room not through aggression or performance, but through a quality of being that suggests this man has been in rooms like this many times and has never been the one who came out of them diminished. Across from him sat Agent Dara Fenn of the FBI, a woman who carried the specific quality of someone who has been holding classified weight for a long time and has reached the point where being able to set it down finally in a room with the right people feels like something between professional obligation and physical relief. Beside her, a representative from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan who communicated entirely through function and whose name Reed was told and immediately lost because some people occupy a room as an institutional role rather than as a person, and this man was entirely that. Agent Fenn laid it out with the undecorated precision of someone who has been rehearsing this briefing for a long time in the knowledge that the moment to deliver it would eventually come. The network, 3 years of operation across 4 states, infrastructure fraud, running through legitimate city contracts with such thorough embedding that every investigative thread led back to a transaction that looked from outside like ordinary government procurement. 22 months of federal investigators circling the structure without finding the entry point, until a 16-year-old boy stood at a fence line for 40 seconds too long. Carl Whitmore, 9 years in the Pittsburgh Marshal's Office, security clearance. that gave him access to everything that mattered: witness locations, protection, timetables, case file contents. 14 months of selling that access to the network he was supposed to be helping prosecute. 3 burn protection arrangements, each collapsed, looking from outside like the ordinary failure of an underfunded federal system, rather than the deliberate sabotage it was. The financial relationship maintained with such administrative care that it had generated for its recipients not just money, but something more valuable. The ability to move through federal investigations like weather through open windows, felt everywhere and stopped nowhere. Nora Calloway had not been attacked because someone panicked. She had been attacked because Carl Whitmore had sold the protection arrangement within 48 hours of its activation, providing names, addresses, schedules, the complete operational picture of what was being built around Reed. The 2 men in the parking structure on a Wednesday evening had been a message delivered in the specific vocabulary of people who communicate through physical consequence. Reed sat against the wall and listened to the architecture of his own life being described by people who had been studying it from the outside for longer than he had known they were looking. 9 months of survival assembled day by day in ignorance of its own structure. The why beneath the what finally made visible. He did not move during the briefing. His hands rested on his knees. His back was straight. He held the information the way he had learned in 9 months of holding difficult things, to hold it completely without flinching, without looking for exits from the discomfort of knowing. When Fenn finished, the room was quiet. Steele Voss had not moved during the entire briefing. He sat with his hands flat on the table, and his eyes on Fenn, and the expression of a man processing something that requires more interior space than is immediately available. The processing that does not show on the surface because the surface is being held deliberately still while everything beneath it reorganizes. Then he did something that nobody in the room had anticipated. He asked about Nora. Not about the case, not about what came next legally or strategically or procedurally. He asked about Nora Calloway, currently at UPMC Presbyterian in Pittsburgh, fractured right wrist, 3 cracked ribs on the left side, and he asked with the quiet, specific attention of a man who has already decided what he's going to do about the answers before he hears them. He asked about her recovery, about the quality of her current care, about whether the facility where she was being treated was the right facility for what she needed. Fenn told him, carefully, completely. Steele nodded once. He said nothing further on the subject. But Briggs stepped into the hallway 20 minutes later and made a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. Reed could not hear the words through the closed door, but he could hear the cadence, the short sentences, the deliberate pauses, the single moment where Briggs's voice dropped below what the door could carry. Reed looked at his hands on his knees. He thought about Nora on the floor of a hospital parking structure, calling him before she called 911, controlling her voice. Because 11 years of cardiac nursing had given her a voice for impossible moments that she used now, even when the impossible moment was her own body broken on concrete. He thought, this is what 40 seconds at a fence line costs. This is the complete invoice. Everything since May, the running, the 7 months, the shelter floors, the cold, the rationed food, the broken compass, the rubber band around the sketchbook. This is what standing at that gap for 40 seconds instead of 39 cost. And the largest line item on the invoice had been paid by someone who had not chosen to pay it. And then underneath that thought, quieter and more durable, I would do the bridge again. Not the fence line. He would have kept walking on that May night, would have crossed to the other side of River Avenue before he reached the gap in the chain link, would have paid whatever it cost in terms of the case and the investigation to not have been standing there at the wrong moment, because the cost had been too high and had been paid largely by his mother. But the bridge he would do again without hesitation, without the knowledge of what led to it, on any night, in any month, in any city where he happened to be crossing a bridge and heard a sound underneath the wind that cut through it wrong. He understood this about himself now, clearly sitting in a room in Newark, eating a sandwich that Briggs had produced somewhere during the drive, the first full meal in 3 days. He would still stop. He would still drop the backpack. He would still go over the railing at 130 feet in February with numb fingers and a hole in his shoe, because nobody else had. Steele spoke. He did not negotiate. He did not bargain or present conditions or do any of the transactional work that the room had been quietly waiting for. He stated 2 things as facts. The first, his organization would provide Agent Fenn's office with documentation they had been accumulating for 8 months, evidence against the corrupt faction and against Whitmore's operation that federal investigators had not been able to obtain through their own channels. He said this without framing it as a trade. The faction had operated under his name without his knowledge and without his sanction. That was a debt that existed independent of calculation. The second Reed Calloway would receive real protection. Properly structured, personally overseen by Agent Fenn with direct accountability to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The kind that did not leak because leaking required access, and the access would be controlled in ways that Whitmore's arrangement had not controlled it. Fenn agreed without hesitation. The attorney representative went slightly pale and said nothing, which in that room constituted the consent it needed to constitute. Reed sat against the wall and listened to the terms of his own future being arranged by people who were, for the first time in 9 months, arranging it in his direction. He felt something that was not quite relief. Relief implied the danger was over, and the danger was not over yet, but something in the same register. The specific sensation of weight that has been present so long you've forgotten its weight being seen and named by people who can see it from the outside. He didn't cry. He sat straight and held the weight a little longer because it wasn't done yet, and he had gotten through 9 months of practice very good at holding things. Outside on Ferry Street, the Ironbound District was conducting its afternoon business with the indifferent energy of a neighborhood that has seen too much to be surprised by most things. The Portuguese restaurant below was filling for lunch. The smell of bread and something with garlic came up through the floorboards and into the room, specific and ordinary, and entirely uninterested in the significance of what was being decided in the room above it. In Briggs Malone's jacket pocket, a message was already moving toward a private rehabilitation facility in western Pennsylvania. 3 days after that, without paperwork and without any record in any system, that any institutional representative in that room had official knowledge of Nora Calloway would be transferred to a facility where the rooms had windows and the physical therapy was not conducted in a hallway, and nobody would approach her in a parking structure ever again. Reed did not know this yet. He knew Briggs had made a call. He knew what that call was likely to have been about the same way he knew where the SUV was going before Briggs told him. He sat with the knowing and waited for what came next. What came next was Carl Whitmore. Carl Whitmore still had to be found. Carl Whitmore was not a man who panicked. This was the thing that had made him useful for 14 months, the quality that the people who had paid for his access had purchased along with the access. He was methodical, patient. He had the specific emotional architecture of someone who has spent 2 decades in federal law enforcement learning to work inside extreme situations without letting the extremity become a variable that affects the outcome. He had sold witness locations and burned protection arrangements and communicated through proxies with people who operated in the spaces where law enforcement stopped, and he had done all of it with the administrative composure of someone who has convinced himself that what he is doing is simply a more accurate accounting of how the world actually works than the accounting offered by the institutions he was betraying. But the name on Briggs Malone's phone screen read, "From the doorway of a shelter in Bushwick," had changed the calculation in a way that composure could not fully absorb. Agent Dara Fenn, FBI, the specific division, the specific field office. He had known in the abstract that the federal case was still building. Cases like this one didn't stop building simply because the most important witness had disappeared into the shelter system. They built more slowly along different routes, but they built. He had factored this into his planning and had continued to factor it in through 11 days of shelter volunteering under a different name, through 11 days of watching Reed Calloway sleep in the same corner near the same radiator while working out how to manage the final variable in the problem. What he had not factored in was Steele Voss. What he had not factored in was the specific convergence of a bridge at 2 in the morning and a girl who said her last name into the wind and a boy who heard it and understood it and walked away into the fog carrying that understanding along with everything else he had been carrying for 9 months. He left the shelter volunteer roster by not returning to it. He left the budget motel near the Gowanus Canal where he had been living under a borrowed name by not returning to that either. He moved, which was what you did when the calculation changed. You moved and you reassessed and you found the new shape of the problem. He drove west through the Holland Tunnel in a car registered to a name that existed only on paper, and came out on the Jersey side with the Manhattan skyline in the rearview mirror and the flat gray of a February morning in New Jersey ahead of him, offering nothing, making no case for itself as a place worth being. He drove to Weehawken, a budget motel near the waterfront cache, no questions asked, a room he had not used before, which was the point. Second floor facing the parking lot. He sat on the edge of the bed and ran the calculation again from the beginning. He ran it for 2 hours looking for the angle that still worked, the thread that could still be managed, the version of events that ended somewhere other than where he could feel it ending. The calculation did not improve. At some point in the early evening, he lay down on top of the covers without taking off his jacket and stared at the ceiling, which was the specific off-white of budget motel ceilings everywhere, stained in the upper left corner with something old enough to have become architectural rather than incidental. He thought about the boy on the bridge, not with malice, with the specific exhaustion that comes from having run an operation long enough to encounter the variable you could not account for. A 16-year-old boy with a hole in his shoe who had stopped on a bridge in February when everyone else who was warm and had options had not stopped, who had then survived 9 months of conditions that should, by the statistical likelihood of such things, have produced a break, a surfacing, a call to someone, a visible desperation that could be located and managed, who had not broken. Whitmore had spent 22 years reading people as collections of motivations and vulnerabilities and predictable responses to sustained pressure. He had no framework for Reed Calloway, not for any of it. He stared at the ceiling and arrived somewhere around midnight at the conclusion that the calculation had been wrong from the beginning. Not the operational calculation that had been executed correctly by his own assessment right up until the bridge. The foundational calculation. The one about what kind of person Reed Calloway was and what that kind of person could sustain. He had underestimated the boy. That was the whole of it, the entire sum. He fell asleep. The sleep of someone who has been running long enough that the body overrides the preference to continue and simply stops the way an engine stops when it has run through everything available to run on. He was still asleep when the knock came at 6:20 in the morning. He knew what it was before he opened his eyes. Not because he had expected it at this specific motel at this specific hour, he hadn't, not precisely, but because certain sounds carry their meaning and their quality, and the quality of this knock was not the quality of any of the ordinary sounds. A budget motel produced at 6 in the morning. He got up. He did not reach for the jacket. He understood that reaching for the jacket was not a move that existed in this version of the situation, and that understanding this clearly was the most functional thing he could do with the next several minutes. He opened the door in his white undershirt and his socks. 2 federal agents stood in the hallway. Not tactical gear, not weapons drawn. The ordinary professional clothing of people who had come to complete a task and had sufficient confidence in the completeness of the preparation behind them to dress for the paperwork rather than for a confrontation. The agent on the left produced a badge. She said his name, his actual name, not the shelter name, not any of the borrowed names, with the specificity of someone who has known it for a long time and has been waiting for the moment to use it. He nodded once. He said nothing. There was no press conference, no cameras, no handcuffed walk down a courthouse corridor for the evening news. No statement from the U.S. Attorney's Office, not that morning. 2 federal agents and a man in a white undershirt in a motel hallway in Weehawken, New Jersey at 6:20 in the morning. That was the entirety of what happened. That was the theater. The quietness of it was its own verdict. 22 years of federal law enforcement had given Whitmore enough of a framework to understand that the absence of cameras was not an oversight. It was a message. It meant the case was still building. It meant this moment was not the end of the sequence, but a point inside it. He understood this in the time it took to put on his jacket and his boots and take a final look at the room. He walked out of it without being asked twice. The door closed behind him with the sound of something ordinary ending. Across the Hudson River, in a private room at a hospital in Brooklyn, Elena Voss was being told by a doctor with careful eyes that the concussion had resolved without complication, that the laceration above her eye had closed cleanly, that the bruising would take another week, and that she was being discharged that morning. She listened to all of this with the focused attention of someone who has spent 4 days in a hospital bed with significant unstructured time in which to think, and has therefore already processed most of what the doctor is saying and arrived at her own conclusions about it. She asked one question when he finished. She asked whether she could arrange before she left to meet with a specific person who was not a family member and not a medical professional, and she gave the name. The doctor said he would see what he could do. Steele Voss was in the corridor when the doctor came out. He had been at the hospital every morning for 4 days, arriving before visiting hours through the combination of presence and the specific quality of stillness that communicates without confrontation, that being redirected is not something you are available for. He came out of Elena's room when the doctor knocked. The doctor described the meeting request. Steele was quiet for a moment. Then he went back into the room and sat in the chair beside his daughter's bed and looked at her. She said, "You found him." He said, "We did." She said, "Is he all right?" It was not a question in its function, though it was a question in its grammar. It was the statement of someone who has already decided that the answer is yes and is looking for confirmation. "He said he is." She said, "I want to see him before we go." He said, "I know." He reached over and straightened the blanket at the foot of her bed, a small, specific, unnecessary gesture that parents perform around their children in hospitals because the hands need something to do while the heart is managing more than it can express. Then he said, "There's something you should know about him first." He told her about Pittsburgh, about the gap in the chain link fence in the 40 seconds, and what those 40 seconds had cost a boy who had not chosen the position of paying them. He told her about 9 months of shelter floors and broken compasses, and the specific kind of invisible that is not the ordinary invisibility of anonymity, but the invisibility of someone who has had to unmake their own visibility in order to continue existing. He did not tell her about the sketchbook. He did not know about the sketchbook. Nobody did except Reed. Elena listened to all of it without interrupting. She was 17 years old, and she had grown up in a world where certain things were demonstrated rather than declared, where the weight of a name meant something specific, where the distance between a decision and its consequence was reliably short. She had grown up watching her father navigate that world with a particular kind of integrity that she had spent her entire life absorbing without ever quite having the language for it. She had some of the language now. She said he stopped when nobody else did. Steele said yes. She said, "I want to see him." Reed was brought to the family waiting room on the third floor at 9:40 in the morning. Briggs walked with him to the door and opened it, and did not go in because some rooms are for specific people, and this one was for two. The room was small. Two chairs pulled close to the window facing each other at an angle that suggested someone had thought about this arrangement rather than defaulted to it. A low table between them held a paper cup of water that neither of them would drink. The window looked out over the East River, and through the gray February air, the Brooklyn Bridge was visible, its towers above the fog line, its lights still on against the pale sky. Elena was in the left chair, gray hospital sweatshirt, hair down, a bandage above her left eye, the bruising around it having developed over 4 days into the deep purple and yellow at the edges that the body produces when it is keeping the record of damage, the visible accounting of what has happened and when. She looked, Reed thought, like someone who has been very close to the edge of something and has come back and is still in the process of understanding what coming back from that particular edge means. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had drawn her face twice. Once from memory on a September evening in a shelter common room, 40 minutes of work to get the angle of the jaw right, and the specific quality of the expression, the alertness and the thing underneath the alertness that he still didn't have a word for. Once more in the margins of a different page, 3 weeks later when he had found himself returning to the face without having decided to the way you return to things that haven't finished being processed. Seeing her in person was different from the drawings in the specific way that the subject itself is always different from the record of it. The drawings were accurate, he was certain of this, with the specific confidence that comes from years of rendering faces as a form of precision rather than impression. But accuracy was not the same thing as presence. The drawings held what he had seen. They could not hold the quality of being in the same room with it. She said, "I heard you don't remember meeting me." He said, "I never met you." She said, "You were on that bridge." He said, "That's not meeting." She considered this. She looked at the window for a moment at the bridge visible through the glass at the fog moving slowly across the water below. Then she asked, "Why didn't you keep walking?" It was the question he had expected because it was the question anyone who understood the full situation would eventually arrive at. Not an accusation, a genuine inquiry into the mechanism of a decision that did not from the outside follow from any available information about who he was or what he had to lose or what keeping walking would have cost him, which was nothing visible. He reached into his backpack. He took out the sketchbook and removed the rubber band and opened it to the page near the middle and held it out to her. She took it. She looked at it for a long time. It was her face rendered in the careful lines of someone who draws faces as a way of holding the world still long enough to understand it. Detailed enough that there was no ambiguity about the subject. The angle of the jaw, the quality of alertness in the eyes, The thing underneath the alertness that he still could not put a word to, but had put into charcoal on a September evening in a shelter common room from a 20-second sighting on the promenade. She looked at the date in the lower right corner, September 19th. She looked up at him. He said, "I saw you on the promenade. You walked past the bench where I was sitting. I don't think you noticed me. I drew it that evening because I always draw faces I can't stop thinking about. I didn't know your name. I didn't know anything about you." She looked back at the drawing. The room held what he had said in the way that rooms hold things too large for immediate processing, quietly without commentary, leaving the work of interpretation entirely to the people inside it. She said, "And on the bridge. Did you recognize me?" He said, "Not right away. It was dark and it was bad. I just saw someone and I stopped. But after when you said your name, I went back through everything and I recognized you." She said, "And you still left before the police came." He said, "I had to." She said, "I know. My father told me why." The bridge held its position in the window behind her, indifferent and permanent, going about the continuous business of being a bridge, connecting one side to the other through everything the city had experienced since 1883 and would experience after them. The repaired section of guardrail was not visible from this angle at this distance. The bridge looked whole and uninterrupted the way things look when the evidence of what happened to them has been properly attended to. She handed the sketchbook back. She said, "You can keep it." The drawing. He said, "It's yours if you want it." She said, "I know. Keep it anyway." He took it back. He looked at the drawing for a moment, at the date at the face, at the distance between September 19th and the night on the bridge, and what that distance had contained. Then he put the rubber band around the sketchbook and put it in the backpack, and sat with the backpack on his knees and the window behind her and the bridge in the window. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm doing it." They sat for a few more minutes without speaking, and the silence was not uncomfortable in the way that silence is not uncomfortable between people who have already said the thing that needed most to be said. Outside, the city went about its morning in the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, and entirely unconcerned with the specific weight of what was happening in a small room on the third floor of a hospital on its eastern edge. Then she stood up and he stood up and she looked at him one final time, that direct, undecorated attention of someone who has been very close to not being in any room ever again, and understands now what rooms are, and then she walked to the door and opened it and went back to her father. Reed stood at the window. The Brooklyn Bridge was visible through the gray morning air, its towers, its cables in their familiar pattern. The long horizontal line of it, connecting Brooklyn to Manhattan, the way it had been connecting them for over a century, through everything the city had done to itself, and everything that had been done to the city, and everything that simply happened to it the way weather happens. From this distance and angle, you could not see the repaired section. The bridge looked whole. It looked like it had always looked. But Reed could locate the exact point on the span from memory, could calculate the distance from the Manhattan Tower to the spot where the railing had been without pausing, could see in his mind with precision the bent metal and the scrape marks, in the dark stain in the frost that had existed at 6 in the morning, and did not exist now because 220 men had arrived with tools and materials and the focused intention of making it not exist anymore. He picked up his backpack and put it on. He went to the door. Briggs was in the corridor, leaning against the wall with a paper cup of coffee, the expression of a man who is comfortable waiting and who has been waiting for a particular moment that has now arrived. He handed Reed a second coffee without being asked. Reed took it. They walked to the elevator. Briggs said, "There's something you need to do tonight." Reed said, "The envelope." Briggs said, "Yes." Reed said, "I know." He had known since the drive from Bushwick to Newark. Had known the envelope needed its own room, its own specific quality of solitude, its own moment that was separate from all the other moments of the preceding 48 hours. The room in Newark had been too full of other weight. The hospital corridor had been too public. The waiting room with Elena had been for something else entirely, something that had needed to be only what it was. The right moment was ahead of this one. He would know it when he reached it. Briggs drove him to Lower Manhattan, to a building 3 blocks from the water, on a street Reed did not know, with a key-coded door and a second key-coded door inside, and a staircase that went up without an elevator, and a hallway on the 4th floor that smelled of fresh paint. The specific smell of a space that has been recently prepared for someone, made ready in the deliberate way that certain people make things ready when the preparation matters. The room was small: a bed, a window, a table, a chair, A bathroom with a door that closed completely, which Reed stood inside for 30 seconds, with the door closed, simply standing in the specific silence of a room within a room before coming back out. On the table centered was the envelope. The same envelope that Gloria had placed in the outer pocket of his backpack at the shelter on Myrtle Avenue, slightly worn at the corners from 2 days of riding in the backpack through everything those 2 days had contained. Reed had felt it during the drive to Newark, had registered its presence, and understood in the wordless way that certain things communicate themselves that it was not the right moment, that the right moment existed ahead of that one. Briggs left without ceremony. He said there was food in the small refrigerator under the table. He said Agent Fenn would be in contact in the morning. He said the key codes would come by text to the new phone on the table, already charged, already activated. At the door, he said one more thing. He said whatever's in there, it was written by someone who was paying attention, a long time before any of the rest of us were. Then he closed the door, and Reed heard his footsteps in the hallway, and then the staircase, and then nothing. Just the building settling into its own rhythms, holding its contents against the dark, the way buildings do. Reed sat in the chair at the table. He looked at the envelope. Outside the window, New York went about its permanent business, indifferent, continuous, entirely unconcerned with the specific weight of what was happening in a small room on the fourth floor of one of its countless buildings. The river moved south toward the harbor. The bridge lights held their vigil against the dark. Somewhere across the water, 220 motorcycles sat in garages from Newark to Providence, their engines cold, their riders home the operational weight of the last 24 hours, dispersing back into the ordinary structure of their lives like heat dispersing into the air around it. He picked up the envelope. He opened it with the care you give to things you understand are not the kind of thing you want to damage in the opening. Inside a single sheet of paper, a photocopy, the gray, slightly washed quality of something copied from an original that was not available to be sent directly. The handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who has written a great deal over a long time and has learned through that practice to be economical with space and exact with word choice. It was addressed to Raymond Voss. Reed read it. He read it the way you read something when you understand that each sentence is going to cost you something, and you don't yet know what the total will be, but you have committed to paying it. Slowly, without skipping ahead, taking each sentence in sequence and letting it settle before moving to the next. The letter described a situation in Pittsburgh, a federal case being built against a network that had compromised elements of the Marshal Service through a specific individual whose name the letter's author knew, because the letter's author was adjacent to the systems that individual operated within adjacent, in a way that gave the author both knowledge and vulnerability, both the ability to see what was happening and the inability to act on that, seeing through official channels without destroying whatever cover made the seeing possible. The case needed a witness. The witness was a boy who had been in the wrong place at a fence line for 40 seconds and had an extraordinary memory for faces, and had already been identified as a witness and already been targeted by the specific individual who had compromised the arrangement meant to protect him. The letter said the systems could not protect the boy. It said this not with bitterness, but with the specific clarity of someone who has spent a long time inside a system and has arrived at a precise understanding of its limits, not as a criticism of the system, but as an accurate accounting of what it was capable of in the specific conditions of this specific case. It said, I am asking you to do what the system cannot. I am asking you to watch for him and keep him safe through means that do not run through the systems that have already been compromised. I am asking you because you are the only person I know with both the reach and the reasons to do this quietly and do it correctly, and because what I am asking does not require explanation beyond what I have given, and I believe you will understand it. I do not ask for conditions or guarantees. I ask for your word. And then he does not know I exist. His mother believes I am dead. I made decisions a long time ago that I would not revisit if I could go back, with one exception. The exception is that I did not find a way to tell him. I am telling you now so that someone who can act on this information will have it. Reed turned the page over. Nothing on the back. He turned it to the front and looked at the signature at the bottom below the last sentence in the same small, precise hand. Owen Calloway. He sat with that name in the room for a long time. His father. The man Nora had told him in the way that parents sometimes manage difficult truths by providing survivable versions of them died before you were born, which was not the same thing as never existed. Which was not the same thing as was never watching. Owen Calloway. A man who had been inside the federal system adjacent to the systems the letter said, and the careful phrasing of that told Reed something specific about what adjacent had actually meant, had meant proximity and knowledge, and the ability to see from a position that required not being officially part of what he was seeing. A man who had made decisions he did not describe and did not apologize for, and did not ask forgiveness for, because the letter was not about any of those things. The letter was functional. The letter was a man doing the one thing that was still available to him to do from wherever he was in whatever situation he had put himself in or found himself in. He had seen it coming. Before Pittsburgh, before the fence line, before any of it had happened, he had seen the shape of what was building, had seen it from whatever adjacent position gave him that view. And he had written to Steele Voss not as a response to anything that had already happened, but as a preparation for what he could see was going to happen. A piece of infrastructure laid in before the emergency arrived, before the bridge, before the protection arrangement collapsed, before Nora was approached in the parking structure. 14 months before the night on the bridge. He had seen it, and he had done the only thing he could do about it from where he was. He had found the person with both the reach and the reason to protect a boy he had never told about himself. And the reach had been enough, and the reason had been enough. Reed set the letter down on the table. He sat for a long time in the chair in the room in Lower Manhattan with the window and the river and the cold night pressing gently against the glass and the letter on the table and the sketchbook in his backpack with the rubber band around it and the drawing on the page near the middle with September 19th in the lower right corner. He thought about Nora's voice from the floor of a parking structure, controlled in the way 11 years of cardiac nursing makes a voice controlled, even when the impossible circumstance is your own body telling him to run, telling him she loved him in the way parents say it when they are not certain of the count of remaining opportunities. He thought about 220 engines dying within 4 seconds of each other on a bridge in Brooklyn at 6 in the morning, and the catastrophic silence that followed, and what it meant when that much force chose in complete coordination to express itself as stillness. He thought about Steele Voss, placing both palms flat against the damaged section of railing and bowing his head and 220 men behind him, not moving, not speaking. He thought about Elena in a gray hospital sweatshirt asking why he hadn't kept walking, and the sketchbook open to the page with September 19th in the corner, and the room holding what that meant quietly because there was no language assembled correctly for it. He thought about the name at the bottom of the letter and what it meant that someone he had never known had been paying attention from whatever distance he had made necessary, and had thought ahead and had placed the one piece of infrastructure that needed to be placed before the emergency arrived. He did not know where Owen Calloway was. The letter contained nothing that would tell him, and he understood that this absence was deliberate. Some things needed to be found through different means at a different moment when the conditions were right for the finding. The letter was not that means. The letter was something simpler and more complete than directions. It was a father saying, "I saw you. I could not be there. I made sure someone else was." Reed sat with that for a long time. Outside the window, the East River moved south toward the harbor the way it always had, carrying everything offered to its surface for a while. The light of the bridge and the reflections of the buildings and the darkness between them, and then releasing it all to the open water, indifferent and constant, and entirely unconcerned with the human business being conducted along its banks. The Brooklyn Bridge was not visible from this window. He knew the direction of it could have oriented toward it through the wall without hesitation, but the window faced a different angle and showed him a different stretch of the river. He did not need to see it. He knew it was there. He knew what it looked like now, the repaired section sitting flush with the sections around it, the new metal bending the light in a slightly different way than old metal would, slightly brighter at the angles, which would resolve over time as weather and use, and the ordinary passage of months normalized it. Eventually, you would not be able to tell the repaired section from any other section. The bridge would simply be the bridge whole and continuous, connecting one side to the other the way it had always done. He folded the letter along its original creases and put it in the sketchbook behind the last page of drawings, in the space between the final page and the back cover, where he sometimes kept things he wanted to carry without displaying. He put the rubber band around the sketchbook and put it in the backpack and set the backpack against the wall beside the bed. He lay down without taking off his jacket. He looked at the ceiling of the room, clean and white and unstained, and the ceiling of the first safe room he had occupied in 9 months. Outside New York continued its permanent and extraordinary and entirely indifferent business of being itself. The river moved, the bridges held, The lights of the city pressed against the February dark and did not win and did not stop, which was its own kind of answer to a question nobody had to ask out loud. Somewhere across that water, 220 motorcycles sat cooling in garages from Newark to Providence, their engines quiet, their riders home, the debt they had come to pay discharged in the only language they had ever fully trusted, the language of showing up. Reed closed his eyes. For the first time in 9 months, he did not listen for the door.